Hello guys, today we will study about forearm. So the first of all we will see the sensory nerve supply. The lateral cutaneous nerve of forearm supplies from the musculocutaneous nerve and the medial cutaneous nerve of forearm and the posterior cutaneous nerve of forearm. So in this diagram we can see this area is supplied by the posterior cutaneous nerve of forearm and this area is supplied by the lateral cutaneous nerve of forearm and this area is supplied by the medial cutaneous nerve of forearm and this area is supplied by the lateral cutaneous nerve of forearm. So this is the cutaneous innervation of forearm. Now we will study about the superficial veins. There are three veins: the cephalic veins, median cubital vein and basilic vein. The cephalic vein arises from the lateral side of the dorsal venous arch on back of hand. It winds around the lateral border of forearm. It extends in the cubital fossa and up front of arm on the lateral side of the bicep muscle, and it terminates in axillary vein in deltopectoral triangle. The median cubital vein, a branch of the cephalic vein in the cubital fossa, runs upward and medially and it joins the basilic vein. So the basilic vein, it arises from the medial side of the dorsal venous arch on the back of hand. It winds around the medial border of the forearm. It then extends into the cubital fossa and up the front of arm on the medial side of bicep muscle, and then it terminates by joining venae committantes of brachial artery to form axillary vein. It receives median cubital vein and variable number of tributaries from median and posterior surface of upper limb. The superficial lymph vessels from thumb, lateral fingers and lateral area of hand and forearm goes into the inferior clavicular nodes. From the medial fingers, medial area of hand and forearm, they terminate in the lateral axillary nodes. Interosseous membrane. Interosseous membrane unites the shaft of radius and ulna. It is attached to their interosseous borders. Its fibers run obliquely downward and medially. It provides attachment for neighboring muscles. The flexor and extensor retinaculum are the two strong bands of deep fascia that hold the long flexor and extensor tendon in position at the wrist. Flexor retinaculum. Flexor retinaculum is a thickening of deep fascia that holds long flexor tendons in position at wrist. It stretches across front of wrist and converts concave interior surface of hand into an osteo-fascial tunnel, the carpal tunnel. The carpal tunnel is for the passageway of median nerve and flexor tendons of thumb and fingers. It is attached medially to pisiform bone and hook of hamate and laterally to the tubercle of scaphoid and trapezium bones. The lower border is attached to palmar aponeurosis. So in this diagram, this is a cross section. We can see here flexor retinaculum. Here is a flexor retinaculum, and median nerve passes in the carpal tunnel, and the flexor tendons, flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus. These tendons of these muscle passes beneath the flexor retinaculum. Extensor retinaculum. Extensor retinaculum is a thickening of deep fascia that stretches across the back of the wrist and holds long extensor tendons in position. It converts groove on the posterior surface of the distal end of radius and ulna into 6 separate tunnels for the passageway of long extensor tendons. The tunnels are separated from one another by fibrous septa that pass from the deep surface of the retinaculum to the bones. So the retinaculum is attached medially to pisiform bone and hook of hamate and laterally to the distal end of radius. The upper and lower borders of retinaculum are continuous with the deep fascia of forearm and hand. The compartments of forearm: interior compartment, which is known as the flexor compartment, and posterior compartment, which is also known as extensor compartment. So now we will go through about the contents of the interior facial compartment of the forearm. So first of all, we will go through the muscles. They are present in three numbers: superficial group, intermediate group, and deep group. Superficial group includes pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. The intermediate group is formed by the flexor digitorum superficialis. The deep group is formed by flexor pollicis longus, flexor digitorum profundus, and pronator quadratus. The blood supply of the interior facial compartment of forearm is by ulnar and radial arteries. The nerve supply is that all the muscles are supplied by median nerve except flexor carpi ulnaris and the medial part of flexor digitorum profundus, which is supplied by ulnar nerve. So the flexor carpi ulnaris and the medial part of the flexor digitorum profundus is supplied by the ulnar nerve. So in this diagram we can see pronator teres. The origin of this muscle is for the humeral head, arises from the medial epicondyle of humerus, and the ulnar head arises from the medial border of the coronoid process of ulna. The insertion of this muscle is on the lateral aspect of shaft of radius. It is supplied by median nerve. The nerve roots are C6, C7. Action is that pronation and flexion of forearm. The flexor carpi radialis, origin is from the medial epicondyle of humerus, and its insertion is on the basis of the second and third metacarpal bone. Nerve supply is by the median nerve. C6, C7 are the nerve roots, and it flexes and abducts hand at wrist joint. The third muscle is palmaris longus. Its origin is from the medial epicondyle of humerus. The insertion of this muscle is at the flexor retinaculum and palmar aponeurosis. The nerve supply is median nerve. C7, C8 are the nerve roots, and it flexes hand. The flexor carpi ulnaris also has two heads. The humeral head originates from the medial epicondyle of humerus. Its insertion is on the pisiform bone and the hook of hamate base at the fifth metacarpal bone, and its nerve supply is from the ulnar nerve. The nerve roots are C8, T1. It flexes adducts hand at wrist joint, and the ulnar head arises from the medial aspect of olecranon process and the posterior border of ulna. So now we see the flexor digitorum superficialis. The humero-ulnar head arises from the medial epicondyle of humerus, medial border of the coronoid process of ulna, and its insertion is on the middle phalanx of medial four fingers. It is supplied by median nerve. C7, C8, T1 nerve roots. It flexes middle phalanx of fingers and assists in flexing proximal phalanx and hand. The radial head arises from the oblique line on the interior surface of the shaft of radius. So now we see the flexor pollicis longus. The interior surface of the shaft of radius is the origin of this muscle, and the insertion is at the distal phalanx of thumb. The interior interosseous branch of median nerve supplies the flexor pollicis longus muscle. Nerve roots are C8, T1. It flexes distal phalanx of thumb. The flexor digitorum profundus origin is from the anteromedial surface of the shaft of ulna. The insertion is at the distal phalanx of the medial forefinger, and it is supplied by ulnar medial half and the median lateral half nerve. The nerve roots are C8 and T1. It flexes distal phalanx of fingers, then assists in flexion of middle and proximal phalanges and wrist. The pronator quadratus, the interior surface of it arises from the interior surface of the shaft of ulna. and the insertion of this muscle is in the anterior surface of shaft of radius. It is supplied by the anterior interosseous branch of median nerve CAT1 are the nerve root and it pronates forearm. So these are the muscles of the anterior compartment of forearm. Now we will study about the muscles of the posterior facial compartment of forearm. The superficial group include extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, extensor carpi ulnaris, and inconeus. The deep group includes the supinator, abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, extensor pollicis longus, and extensor indicis. The blood supply is by the posterior and anterior interosseous arteries, and the nerve supply is by the deep branch of the radial nerve. So, in this diagram, we can see this is the posterior view, superficial. So the muscles we can see here are extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis ulnaris, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor digitorum, and the middle layer extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, and the deep layer consists of enconeus, supinator, abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis longus, and extensor indicis. This is extensor indicis, and extensor pollicis brevis. This is the extensor pollicis brevis and its tendon. So enconeus, supinator, abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis longus, extensor indicis, extensor pollicis brevis. So this is a deep layer of the muscles of the posterior compartment of forearm, and there are also brachioradialis, which origin is from the lateral supracondylar ridge of humerus and insertion is at the base of the styloid process of radius. It is supplied with radial nerve. Nerve roots are C5, C6, C7. It flexes forearm of a forearm artery of humerus elbow joint, and it rotates forearm to the mid prone position. The next muscle is extensor carpi radialis longus muscle. Here, the origin of muscle is from the lateral supracondylar ridge of humerus, and the insertion of this muscle is at the posterior surface of the base of the second metacarpal bone. The nerve supply is by the radial nerve. C6, C7 are the nerve roots, and it extends and abducts hand at wrist joint. So this is a table of the muscles of the posterior compartment of forearm. We can see the first muscle is extensor carpi radialis brevis. It originates from the lateral epicondyle of humerus. The insertion of this muscle is at the posterior surface of the base of the third metacarpal bone. The nerve supply is deep branch of radial nerve. C7, C8 are the nerve root, and it extends and abducts hand at wrist joint. Next muscle is extensor digitorum. The origin of muscle is from the lateral epicondyle of humerus, and the insertion is at the middle and distal phalanges of medial four fingers. Nerve supply is by the deep branch of radial nerve C7, C8, and it extends fingers and hand. The extensor digiti minimi is at the lateral epicondyle of humerus origin, and insertion is the extensor expansion of little finger. The nerve supply is by the deep branch of radial nerve C7, C8, extends metacarpal phalangeal joint of little finger. The next muscle is extensor carpi ulnaris. The origin of this muscle is the lateral epicondyle of humerus. Insertion of this muscle is at the base of the fifth metacarpal bone, and the deep branch of radial nerve supplies it, and the nerve roots are C7, C8, and it extends and adducts hand at wrist joint. The next muscle is enconeus. The origin of this muscle is from the lateral epicondyle of humerus. The insertion is at the lateral surface of the olecranon process of ulna. The nerve supply is by the radial nerve C8, C7, T1 are the nerve root, and it extends elbow joint. The supinator muscle originates from the lateral epicondyle of humerus, annular ligament of the proximal radio-ulnar joint and ulna, and the insertion of this muscle is at the neck and shaft of radius. The nerve supply is by the deep branch of radial nerve. The nerve roots are C5 and C6, and the action of this muscle is in the supination of forearm. And this muscle is the abductor pollicis longus. It arises from the posterior surface of the shaft of radius and ulna. The insertion is at the base of the first metacarpal bone. The nerve supply is by the deep branch of radial nerve C7 C8. It abducts and extends thumb. The next muscle is extensor pollicis brevis. It arises from the posterior surface of the shaft of radius and base of the proximal phalanx of thumb. Deep branch of radial nerve supply is the nerve roots are C7 C8 and it extends metacarpopharyngeal joints of thumb. The next muscle is extensor pollicis longus. The origin of this muscle is from the posterior surface of the shaft of ulna, and the insertion of this muscle is the base of the distal phalanx of thumb. And the deep branch of the radial nerve supply is this, and the nerve roots are C7 C8 and it extends distal phalanx of thumb. The extensor indicis arises from the posterior surface of the shaft of ulna. The origin of this muscle is as the extensor expansion of index finger. It is supplied by the deep branch of radial nerve C7 C8 are the nerve root, and it extends metacarpophalangeal joint of index finger. So this was all about the compartments of forearm. I hope you will like this video. Thank you very much.